Wow, you know how to throw a meeting. So this is my debut at Severance Hall. I've been a little nervous about it. In fact, I had a dream the other night that I had been invited to speak at the Explorers Club. So the next day I looked it up. The members of the Explorers Club include leaders in polar exploration, diving, aerospace, archaeology, astronomy, geology, paleontology, conservation, mountaineering, and speleology. So only in my dreams am I getting an invitation to address the Explorers Club. I believe it was the evening after we had had our conversation and that my brain's wires got crossed and that I confused the Cleveland Foundation with the Explorers Club. And then there was also the fact that my son Ross had recently written about an adventure that I think Mom wasn't supposed to know about, but the Explorers Club might have found interesting. A couple years ago, Ross and my husband Gary went to Alaska, and they were kayaking one day in frigid waters below a glacier when, to their right, they hear an ominous cracking sound, and then another cracking sound to the left, and a chunk of ice the size of an apartment building broke off and fell into the sea. Their first thought was, wow. The second thought was not wow. Soon the glacier, oh, there's Ross. This is after the story happened, but that's the glacier. The picture does not do justice to the height of that glacier. So, because pretty soon the glacier disappears behind a fast-moving 20-foot wave of displaced water bearing down on the kayakers, including my husband and son. Ross, as you see, not only lived to tell the tale, but found some humor in it. He wrote, "We both began to paddle," speaking of himself and his father, "as the swell in front of the glacier grew and grew, and a crest began to form. For an absurd moment, our boat did not move. We were paddling in opposite directions. I, trying to about-face and scram, and Dad attempting to square the nose of our bow to the wave, Bugs and Daffy passing the shotgun barrel back and forth. By the time the wave was on top of us, a frothy crest had formed. We're going in, he thought. He didn't. Though behind that wave was an even bigger one. So I was probably trying to weave that story in my anxiety dream about the speech before the Explorers Club when the anxiety woke me up. But you know, my brain went on trying to come up with material for that speech, and I only fell asleep again when I decided that I could tell about the explorers I've met on the frontiers of our reimagined lives, which I propose to do today. In 4 seasons on today, I've told 32 stories produced by AARP about people over 50 who have reinvented their lives. As our mutual friend Mark Friedman describes it, many of us will be living a bonus decade or 2 or 3. Now, I do not aspire to astonish viewers with stories that might get someone an invitation to speak before the Explorers Club. For example, the story that is in editing right now is about a middle-aged dog, who was in need of reinvention. This is Pransky. Yeah. Well, we tell the story about how Pransky and her owner became a therapy team at a nursing home. The woman in the story is actually a pretty astonishing person. Sue Halpern was a Rhodes Scholar and a Guggenheim Fellow. But her personal story of reinvention as a duo of a therapy team is inspiring, relatable, and doable, but not at all what you were looking for today. In fact, I was told to go large. We've done some big stories. I'll try to tell a few. Jenny Bowen. This is Jenny Bowen. One of the joys of an empty nest is reading the paper together on a Saturday morning. Look at this, Jenny's husband Richard said almost 20 years ago. They were 49. It was an article about baby girls being abandoned in China just because they were girls. It was estimated that since the one-child policy in 1979, 15 million girl babies had been abandoned. The Bowens felt compelled to do something. Richard said, "We could bring one home." Jenny replied, "Yes, let's do that." Just like that. After a long adoption process, when the Bowens went to China to meet their daughter, they were shocked to see rows and rows of cribs, sometimes 2 and 3 babies to a crib, 2,000 children in a single orphanage with untrained caregivers, so overwhelmed it was all they could do to feed and change them. Equally shocking was the silence, as Jenny said. Rooms and rooms full of babies, newborns, a year old, 18 months old, not crying. Babies in these orphanages quickly learn that crying doesn't get them anything. When her daughter Maya was first placed in her arms, Jenny experienced a surge of maternal emotion, but felt absolutely nothing coming back. Maya was emotionally blank. She couldn't walk, though she was 2 years old. She had no language because no one had ever talked to her. The Bowens brought her home. Jenny was a filmmaker and screenwriter and was cutting a movie at the time. She set up an editing room in her house, and Maya sat on her lap for 6 months. Her first words were lines of dialogue from a courtroom scene. "He didn't do it." About a year after they brought Maya home, the Bowens were having a backyard party. Jenny glanced out her kitchen window and saw Maya romping around the garden, calling out to her friends, full of life, looking as if she had been adored her whole life. And Jenny had an epiphany. Why don't we just do that for all the kids we can't bring home? I asked how she thought she would accomplish that. She said by finding people who would come in and work with these babies and toddlers and preschoolers and be kind of surrogate parents to hold them and make them feel like their lives matter. But how would she accomplish that? China was not famously open to foreign ideas. Jenny was a mom, but not an expert in child development. She had no more background in policy or diplomacy than I have. She was not wealthy. She didn't speak Chinese. Nonetheless, her career gave way to her vision. And her vision became Half the Sky Foundation, named after a Chinese proverb that women hold up half the sky. Other parents of adopted Chinese babies were her first supporters. She finally had a chance to go to China in 2000, and this is what she said. "We are so grateful for these beautiful children in our lives. We want to work with you as partner to give a gift back to the children who remain in institutions. Will you let us work with you to try to bring the love of family to children who don't have families?" Half the Sky was given 1 year to set up 2 small pilot programs. They began recruiting surrogates. Zuma is a Chinese word for grandmothers. Hundreds of Chinese women applied, about 30 were chosen. A team of Americans gave them training in childcare and nurturing skills. And then they were given children to care for. The results were striking. Children attached to their caregivers, they started making eye contact. Meanwhile, Maya has grown into a bright and beautiful teenager like her little sister, Anya, who the Bowens also adopted 3 years later. And Half the Sky runs programs in over 50 Chinese institutions. Jenny no longer writes screenplays, but she's written a new narrative for hundreds of thousands of children. She found a Chinese quote from 500 AD. All the children who are held and loved will know how to love others. Spread these virtues through the world. Nothing more need be done. Ken Wood. When Ken Wood was young, he figured he'd follow a profession like being a lawyer, but there was no money for college. So he looked around for something to do in rural Maryland, and he found a well drilling business. He learned the trade and started a business of his own. He was not looking for reinvention. He had had 2 major heart attacks before he was 60. He was looking forward to retiring, fiddling around with his classic car collection and his stable of horses. His passion is harness racing. But reinvention found him. It was serendipitous, surprising, and transformational. Now, a well drilling rig is a big piece of machinery on wheels. After he advertised a used one for sale, a church delegation from a small town in Pennsylvania came to see it. They wanted to drill wells in Ghana, in West Africa, where people were literally dying from drinking putrid drinking water. Ken gave them a pretty good deal, and they bought it. And then they asked Ken to show them how to use it in Africa. Ken was not a traveler. He was very busy. A couple weeks later, he attended a small business banking seminar where the keynote speaker, by extremely weird coincidence, was a man from Ghana. And he talked about the desperate need there for fresh water wells. Ken Wood is a religious man. He says he looked up skyward and he said, "I hear ya." Actually, he said it scared the bejesus out of me. And he went to Ghana. He was shown a small puddle. The village water supply, he said, was a scum pond. You wouldn't let your dog drink that water. After he drilled his first well, Ken knew it was going to be the first of many trips. He has since drilled more than 1,000 wells in Africa at his own expense. He sold his car collection, but not the horses. When they win at the track, the money goes into Africa. He says they win when he's in Africa. Ken Wood is thankful now that he didn't go to college and become a lawyer. He saved more lives than if he'd gone to medical school and become a doctor. In Ghana, people pray Ken Wood will live a long life because he's saving so many. Mary Reed, this is Mary Reed. Getting a master's degree 40 years ago as an adult, she aspired to run a community program, which she did, and then a larger one, and then a larger one, but not by dint of personal ambition. Mary's talents were always recognized just a little bit before she recognized them herself, such as her promotion at the Boston YWCA. She was down at the main branch one day. She said everyone was looking like disaster struck. The director had been let go, but the board already had a replacement in mind. It was Mary. At first, she was afraid and said no, but then she said yes and became the first African-American director of the Boston YWCA, which was the first YWCA in America. With Mary, opportunity seems always to be around the bend, catching her by surprise, always before she thought she was ready. But she always says yes, figuring that whatever she didn't know, she would learn. Out of the blue one day, she got a call from a big search company in Boston. Goodwill was looking for a new executive vice president. The job would mean managing a budget 3 times bigger. And as if trying to talk her out of it, she told the CEO, I don't know anything about your core programs for people with disabilities. And the CEO responded, everything you've done shows that you probably can learn, which of course is the story of Mary's life. But at the age of 58 and at the pinnacle of her career, Mary's path took a sharp turn. It wasn't opportunity this time. It was obligation. A little backstory first. Generations of Bostonians sent children to a nursery school run by Bessie Tarts Wilson, who was Mary's mother. Bessie ran the business until the Friday before her death at the age of 72. It had always been a family business, and everybody in the family looked to Mary. She says, was I going to walk away? Though she spent years building a career of her own, she stepped into her mother's shoes. But childcare had changed since the early days when the Tarts daycare served working-class families in the Roxbury area of Boston. The new clientele were families working real hard just to keep ahead of poverty. Mary crunched the numbers and realized the business was unsustainable financially. If a parent lost a job or got in trouble, state child care aid stopped. The school lost tuition, and the child simply vanished from the rolls. That is where Mary Read's reinvention begins. She multiplied the number of children disappearing from her own program times the other programs also experiencing the same dropout phenomenon, and Mary became a child care advocate. Her mother had known intuitively that early education was important to success later in life, but there is hard data and common sense that shows the opposite is also true. The seeds of poverty are planted very early. As I've learned in my own advocacy work, second grade school attendance and fourth grade reading proficiency have been used for decades as benchmarks for policymakers who are forecasting the need for prison beds. Take a vulnerable child out of a stable nursery school. They call this the cradle-to-prison pipeline. Mary Read lobbied the Massachusetts legislature and got the law changed so that now the children of parents who fall behind or mess up don't suffer the disruption in their early education. Mary was, when I met her, already 6 years beyond conventional retirement age. She says her children are always telling her she should be out enjoying life, work in the garden, travel. But she said, I really don't want to. It makes me feel alive to do this work. Barbara Allen. This is a picture of Barbara, who's 65, and her son Roger, who is now 31. They are co-founders and partners of a nonprofit in Philadelphia. Barbara had a background in the arts, but she'd been a stay-at-home mom for 20 years and an active volunteer. And when Roger was in high school and enrolled in a charter school, she volunteered. And among other things, she and Roger turned the school, which was in a converted office building, or rather made it look like a design museum. One day, Barbara was listening to an interview with a new Philadelphia school superintendent. It was a call-in radio show. She called in, invited him to come see her school, and he did, and returned the invitation. He had a job in mind, decorating Philadelphia's new education center. Now, Barbara was not a designer, a decorator, or an architect, but having seen what she'd done at that charter school, he told her she was a placemaker. A what? She said. You make places. You change places, he explained. And the Ed Center in Philadelphia was a building in need of reinvention. It was a former printing plant. Your TV guides probably came from there. Huge. The superintendent wanted Barbara to fill it with children's art, but little children's art pictures would be like fly specks. Her son Roger solved the problem in one word: digital. He said, take a high resolution photograph of child's art and blow it up big. The results were astonishing. They started hanging large-scale reproductions of children's art throughout the building. People were always asking to buy them. They were always saying no. Till one day, a man stopped to look as he was waiting for the elevator. Reading the attached wall label that said the art was the work of a fourth grader, he said, "What can I do to help?" At that moment, Barbara and Roger realized they were onto something bigger. They sketched out the concept for fresh artists on a paper napkin. I saw one of these magnificent enlarged paintings by a sixth grade girl hanging in Blue Cross headquarters in Philadelphia. It was a thank you for a donation to Fresh Artist. Blue Cross gets to hang the painting. The donations pay for art supplies for severely under-resourced Philadelphia classrooms. Philadelphia's allotment for art supplies at that time, no kidding, was 83 cents per child a year. Fresh Artists made children part of the solution. And to see all the other thank yous hanging on the halls of the Blue Cross headquarters was to understand why Barbara Allen is a placemaker. Children's art is transformational in multiple ways. For one thing, children's art makes children visible in places where children are not usually seen. Barbara told me about discovering an incredible work of art by a sixth grade boy that she knew had suffered some pretty hard knocks in his young life, growing up nearby but a world away from the glamorous downtown office building where his art is now hanging. She took him to see it. She stood back, watched him walk closer and closer, finally standing in front of it. He turned to Barbara and said, "I guess I really am somebody." Barbara and her son are not the only stories we've done about an intergenerational partnership, one generation collecting their dots, the other connecting them. As Barbara Allen put it, we all have threads of things that we've done. I've woven mine into a new tapestry. Convergence is the word she used. It was the same word Kirk Rademacher had used. This is Kirk. It's one of our small stories, so I'll tell it quickly. Kirk was a project manager at a cabinet shop in Oakland, California. When the phone rings, he says, it's not somebody saying, "Oh, you did a great job, everything fit, was perfect." It was a stressful job. He happened to be going through a divorce. He found himself becoming socially withdrawn and depressed. One day, he needed to get out of his own head, and he took a walk on a beach, and on a whim, started to build a sand castle. He was being creative. People stopped to watch and talk. He said it was like the sun rising on all the horizons at the same time. The beach became Kirk's weekend de-stressor. He discovered there was a little community of sand carvers. Who knew it was a job? One day at work in Oakland, the phone rang. It was good news this time. He'd been invited to a sand sculpting event in Italy. Kirk had never been to Europe, but he had 5 projects lined up at the shop, and he had to say no. But he decided to give himself 6 months to wind down his obligations and transition full-time to sand sculpting. Now, maybe 1 or 2 of you are going to become sand carvers. Sometimes a reinvention like this seems like an extreme makeover that has nothing to do with you. Until you look more carefully and you see what Kirk and Barbara mean by convergence. Kirk's drafting table is a beach. His tools are shovels and carving knives instead of tracing paper, rulers, and T-squares. He's still designing and building things. He's putting an old fine arts degree to use in a way he'd never imagined. Convergence is a common theme in reinvention, the threads that connect lives to reimagined possibilities. small or large. When I do an interview, I'm often trying to find these threads or connect the dots. I have to say that Jenny Bowen was the hardest. Didn't get it. She did not look like a superwoman. And she explained it for me. She said, I think everything that half the sky is, I learned in my work as a filmmaker. I have an idea, I write a story, I cast it, I find a location, I know how I want it to end, I dream a world that didn't exist, and I find a way to get there. I finally got it. A postscript to my day on the beach with Kirk Rademacher. The night before, I opened the door to my hotel room, unprepared for a big full moon rising over Monterey Bay. I walked over to the balcony and opened the door to the sound of crashing waves on the beach, and I shot a little movie on my phone and sent it to my husband, Gary. I've sent the family pictures like this from hotel rooms before. Gary replied, "You're really seeing the country." That's the thing. I really see it. I notice things, including how I've changed. Travel was one of the most obvious perks of my job. Thanks to NBC, I literally saw the world, but I rarely wanted to go. I hate packing. I hated leaving 3 small children behind. And the glamour of being on assignment has a downside. It is an assignment. These days, I travel more than ever. Maybe not always as glamorous as Cleveland. And I still hate packing. But I no longer have the tug and pull of small children. And the big revelation of my reinvention is that when I send myself, I can't wait to go to Cleveland. And I have a purpose. I've joined a sort of movement. People have told me this, a movement, which I didn't invent. I didn't invent the idea of bonus decades that we're all going to be living. How do we make these bonus decades count? My book that Ron mentioned is coming out in January when the last of the baby boomers is in. We're all over 50. I think that baby boomers are this country's greatest untapped natural resource. We were educated in the best public schools the world had ever seen. As comedian, now senator, leave it to America, Al Franken put it, to be a kid growing up almost in any suburban neighborhood in America was to feel lucky. Anything was possible, and that is true. And now we are in our 50s and 60s, heading towards 70, and we have an opportunity to redeem our youthful promise. So I want to congratulate you on your commitment and your conviction that together you can do big things that you don't yet know about, but are about to find out about. I thank you for letting me come to Cleveland and be a part of it. Thank you.